It started quietly, not with a bang, but with a slow, steady unraveling. For decades, something was breaking beneath the surface of American life, and most people in Washington either didn't notice or chose to look the other way. In towns across the Rust Belt, the hum of factory floors faded into silence. Families who once thrived on the promise of steady work and honest pay watched their communities hollow out. And behind it all, a nagging question grew louder. Why are we still making less while everything else costs more? You didn't need a PhD in economics to feel it. The middle class, the heart of America, was falling behind. While the stock market soared, real wages stagnated. While CEOs cashed in, small businesses struggled to survive. And every year the trade deficit ballooned, like a silent scoreboard showing how much we were losing to countries that didn't play fair. By 2016, the writing was on the wall. America wasn't just losing jobs. We were losing faith in the system itself. Then came someone who looked at the numbers and saw something else entirely. While the media laughed, while the experts rolled their eyes, he saw an opportunity to do what no one else dared. Call out the bad deals, demand better, and, most controversially of all, use tariffs not as a punishment, but as a tool. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about what changed, we need to understand where we were. Let's rewind. In the early 2000s, U.S. manufacturing was in free fall. Between 2000 and 2010, America lost nearly 6 million manufacturing jobs. Whole industries were shipped overseas, not by accident, but by design. Politicians on both sides signed trade deals that sounded good on paper, but gutted the backbone of our economy. China entered the WTO in 2001, and from that moment on, the floodgates opened. By the time Trump arrived on the scene, the trade deficit with China alone had surpassed $350 billion a year. That's not just a number, it's a measure of how much more we were buying from them than they were buying from us. And with every billion that left our shores, another factory closed, another paycheck vanished, another American dream got harder to reach. This wasn't just economics, it was personal. So when Donald Trump stood on that debate stage and said, "They're ripping us off," millions of Americans didn't just hear a slogan. They heard someone finally say out loud what they'd known for years. The system was broken and someone was finally willing to do something about it. And that right there was the beginning of what some called an economic war. But to many Americans, it felt more like a rescue mission. And the story was just getting started. Here's something most politicians never understood. Tariffs aren't just numbers on paper. They're leverage. At least, that's how Donald Trump saw them. Now, I know the word tariff doesn't exactly set hearts racing. For years, it's been treated like a technical detail, something that belonged in an economics textbook, not in a campaign speech. But Trump turned that idea on its head. He used tariffs not as a tax to quietly collect revenue, but as a visible, unapologetic tool for negotiation. A chess move, a power play. Think of it like this. If your trading partner is playing dirty, undercutting your workers, flooding your market with cheap goods, manipulating their currency, what do? Do you smile, shake hands, and keep letting them walk all over you? Or do you finally say, "No more, you want access to our market? Play fair"? That's exactly what Trump did. One of the clearest examples, the 125% tariff on Chinese imports. It wasn't just a random number, it was a message. We're not going to keep buying your goods while you steal our technology and subsidize your state-run companies. At the same time, Trump offered a 10% general tariff to countries who were willing to come to the table in good faith, basically saying, "Let's talk, but hurry." And the world noticed. Countries that had been dragging their feet on trade reform suddenly showed up, ready to negotiate. Mexico, Canada, Japan. Even the European Union started to take things more seriously. Why? Because Trump made it clear. This wasn't just politics, it was policy with teeth. And here's where I get personal. I used to be one of those people who thought tariffs were outdated. I thought they hurt consumers, raised prices, slowed growth. And yes, in some cases, they can do all those things if they're used poorly. But what I came to realize is that when you're in a rigged game, The only way to change the rules is to stop playing by theirs. Trump didn't raise tariffs because he wanted to hurt America. He did it to force a conversation the global elites had been avoiding for decades. And let's be honest, it worked. Negotiations that had been stalled for years suddenly gained momentum. For the first time in a long time, America was playing offense on trade, not defense. And that shift, it made all the difference. Now, some critics still say the tariffs were reckless, that they shook up global supply chains and created uncertainty. And in a way, they're right. Trump's strategy was disruptive. But maybe disruption was exactly what we needed, because the old way of doing things, it left too many Americans behind. Which brings us to the next part of the story, how the markets reacted and what it tells us about where confidence really comes from. Let's take a look. At first, it looked like chaos. When Trump announced his sweeping tariffs, Wall Street didn't just flinch, it panicked. The headlines were brutal. Cable news was on fire with predictions of doom. Analysts warned of a man-made recession. Hedge fund managers called it economic suicide. And former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers compared the U.S. to an unstable emerging market. In a matter of hours, the Dow dropped over 2,000 points. To many in the media, that was it. That was the proof they needed. Trump had pulled the pin and the economy was about to explode. But here's the thing. That's not what happened. Not even close. Because just days later, the markets did something the experts didn't expect. They bounced back. Not gradually, not cautiously. They rebounded hard. Why? It wasn't because the numbers changed. It was because the narrative did. Trump didn't just announce tariffs and walk away. He explained his strategy. He clarified which countries were exempt. He signaled flexibility. That's when investors, who had feared an all-out trade war, began to see something else. A plan. A strategy with boundaries, with goals, and with leverage points. Markets hate uncertainty more than bad news. And what Trump did was replace uncertainty with a clear message. We're negotiating from strength, and we know where we're going. I remember watching the market coverage during that week. Commentators who had confidently mocked the policy just days earlier started backtracking. Some even admitted they might have misjudged it. And to be honest, I found that moment powerful. Not because Trump won, but because it reminded me how fragile our economic narratives are. We tend to treat market reactions like prophecy. If the market drops, we assume disaster is coming. If it rises, we assume everything is perfect. But the truth is, markets aren't fortune tellers. They're emotional. They react fast, sometimes irrationally, to headlines, tone, and timing. They tell us how people feel, not always how things are. And that's the deeper lesson here. Yes, Trump's tariffs spooked Wall Street, but what steadied it wasn't a change in fundamentals. It was a change in confidence. A belief that someone finally had the courage to shake the system without letting it collapse. Now, I'm not saying every investor cheered. Plenty of financial elites still hated the tariffs. But what they couldn't ignore was this. The market didn't crash. It recalibrated. And sometimes recalibration is exactly what a healthy system needs. So while critics were busy predicting collapse, something else was happening, something quieter, and maybe even more important. Main Street was paying attention. And for the first time in a long time, they started to believe again. Which brings us to the heart of this story. The people who stood to gain the most. Not the hedge funders or the boardrooms, but the workers, the welders, the small business owners across this country. Let's talk about them next. Here's a question we don't ask enough. Who really wins when the economy grows? Because for years we were told that if Wall Street did well, eventually the benefits would trickle down to everyone else. But that didn't happen. Not for the small-town factory worker watching jobs disappear overseas. Not for the local mechanic competing with cheap imported parts. Not for the mom-and-pop shop being crushed by big-box chains and global supply chains. So when Trump said he was focused on Main Street, not Wall Street, it wasn't just political rhetoric. It hit home for millions of Americans who felt like they'd been left behind. And here's where the story gets interesting. while the financial press was losing its mind over potential short-term losses. Something else was happening on the ground. Small manufacturers, especially in steel, aluminum, and electronics, began to see demand rise. Jobs that had once been written off as never coming back started to trickle home. One example? U.S. Steel reopened plants in places like Granite City, Illinois, creating hundreds of jobs that had been idle for years. In Ohio, Whirlpool credited tariffs on imported washing machines with protecting over 2,000 American jobs. You don't hear about that much on CNBC, but ask the folks in those towns, and they'll tell you the story. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent put it like this: for the next 4 years, the Trump agenda is focused on Main Street. It's Main Street's turn to hire workers. It's Main Street's turn to restore the American dream. And honestly, I couldn't agree more, because for too long, the conversation about the economy has been dominated by hedge funds, tech giants, and people who measure success by stock tickers. But that's not the whole picture. The real economy lives in places where people clock in every day, fix things, build things, serve their neighbors. Those are the people Trump was talking to, and they knew it. Now, let's be fair. Wall Street didn't exactly suffer. After the initial shock, markets adjusted, and many large firms found new ways to thrive. Some even benefited from renegotiated trade deals, new domestic contracts, and a stronger dollar. But the difference was this: for the first time in a generation, the starting point of the conversation wasn't maximizing shareholder profits. It was protecting American workers. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, was revolutionary. Because when the system starts to center on real people, not just quarterly earnings, it becomes more resilient, more human, and frankly, more American. So yes, Wall Street eventually got on board, but they weren't the heroes of this story. The real heroes were the people on the ground who saw a door open, who rolled up their sleeves and got back to work. And that brings us to the next chapter, the impact overseas, especially in China, where things didn't go quite as planned for our trading rival. Let's dive in. Let me ask you something. If the tariffs were really a disaster, why did China push back so hard? Why did they scramble to respond, cut deals with other countries, and pour billions into damage control? Because the truth is, behind all the headlines and pundit chatter, Trump's trade war hit Beijing where it hurt. Hard. Now, I know the media rarely dove deep into this. Most of the coverage focused on short-term pain in the U.S., higher prices on certain goods, uncertainty in supply chains. But what they didn't show you was the bigger picture playing out across the Pacific. Let's look at the numbers. Between 2018 and 2020, China's exports to the United States fell by over $100 billion. Foreign direct investment into China, a key measure of outside confidence, dropped by nearly 40% in some sectors. And perhaps most telling of all, factory output in key regions like Guangdong and Zhejiang slowed dramatically. Reports surfaced of entire production lines going idle, not because demand was gone globally, but because one of their biggest customers, the United States, was finally pushing back. I remember reading a Bloomberg report that quietly noted something big. Chinese factory owners were starting to shift production out of China to avoid U.S. tariffs, to Vietnam, to India, even to Mexico. Think about that. China, the supposed factory of the world, was bleeding business because America stopped playing by their rules. That's not just economic pressure, that's strategic leverage. Now, I'm not saying it brought China to its knees, but it definitely forced them to blink. And it slowed their rise, at least for a moment, in a way that decades of polite diplomacy never managed to do. To me, this is one of the most underreported parts of the Trump trade strategy. It wasn't about punishing China just for the sake of it. It was about resetting the balance. For years, China had manipulated its currency, subsidized industries, ignored intellectual property laws, and no one held them accountable. Trump did. And while the media might not have liked his tone or tactics, the results spoke volumes. Even the Chinese government, behind closed doors, began offering new concessions and limited market access in response to U.S. pressure. Meanwhile, American companies that had relied heavily on Chinese manufacturing started looking elsewhere. Some came home, some diversified, but the effect was the same. China's grip on global supply chains loosened, and that, long-term, is a game changer. Because it's not just about economics, it's about independence, about not being beholden to a regime that doesn't play fair. And for many Americans, that shift was long overdue. So while the trade war may not have ended with a handshake or a headline, it did something more important. It changed the trajectory, which brings us to something even bigger. What this all meant for the idea of capitalism itself and the people who felt abandoned by it. Let's talk about that. Here's a thought that used to sound radical. Maybe capitalism isn't broken. Maybe it's just been playing favorites. For years, working-class Americans were told that globalization and free markets would benefit everyone, that a rising tide would lift all boats. But in towns across the Rust Belt, those promises sank like stones. Factories shut down, main streets emptied, and the people who built this country with their hands and hard work were told to adapt or retrain. What they heard was, you're on your own. That's why when Trump came along and talked about saving capitalism, not by tearing it down, but by making it fair again, it resonated. He didn't reject the free market. He just asked a simple question. What good is a system if it only works for the people at the top? And for once, someone was putting the forgotten class at the center of the conversation. Let's talk about those forgotten towns in places like Youngstown, Ohio, Erie, Pennsylvania, Flint, Michigan. Folks had been living with economic decline for decades. They'd heard every political promise, every five-point plan, but nothing ever changed. Then, in 2016, something different happened. These voters, many of whom had never supported a Republican before, turned out in huge numbers for Trump. Not because he was polished, not because he fit the political mold, but because he spoke directly to their frustration. He didn't shame them for wanting jobs that didn't require a college degree. He didn't scoff at the idea of made in America. He celebrated it. And that message, that fairness matters, that work matters, that they matter, cut through the noise. Now, I'll be honest, there were times when I wondered if it was just rhetoric. But then I started talking to people in these towns. Real people. People who said, I got my job back. Or, for the first time in years, we're hiring again. That's not politics, that's impact. And here's the deeper lesson. When you ignore the working class, you don't just risk losing elections. You risk losing the very soul of your country. Because when people feel unseen and unheard, they stop believing. Not just in politicians, but in the system itself. Trump understood that. He knew that to save capitalism, you had to restore trust in it. You had to make sure that when people put in the work, they had a fair shot. That message, simple as it is, turned an election. And maybe, just maybe, it started turning the tide. So now the question is, what comes next? Was this a one-time course correction or the beginning of something bigger? Let's explore that in our final chapter. What happens when the movement outgrows the man? That's the question we're left with now, because whether you loved him or couldn't stand him, Donald Trump did something few thought possible. He rewired the way we talk about trade, labor, and fairness in the American economy. But here's the thing about bold change. It only lasts if people carry it forward. So now we have to ask, what happens next? Can another leader pick up the same playbook? Can someone else stand up to global powers, push for working class priorities, and still have the guts to face the backlash? Because the truth is, it's not easy. Tariffs aren't popular with multinational CEOs. Reshoring factories doesn't win applause on Wall Street. Standing up for welders in Wisconsin rarely trends on Twitter. And yet, millions of Americans are watching closely. They remember what it felt like to finally be part of the conversation. To hear someone say, we're going to fight for your job, your dignity, your future. Now imagine what happens if all of that gets rolled back. If the next administration, or the one after that, starts tearing down tariffs just to score points with global elites. What happens to those reopened factories? What happens to the towns that just started to recover? What happens to the hope that was only recently restored. I'll tell you what I think. It would be devastating, not just economically, but emotionally, because once people get a taste of being prioritized, it's hard to go back to being forgotten. This is why Main Street, the real backbone of America, can't afford to check out. Politics isn't something that happens to us. It's something we shape. And if the working class tunes out again, if they stop showing up, speaking up, or holding leaders accountable, then yes, the system might quietly revert. The lobbyists will return, the old trade deals will sneak back in, and the message will be clear. That moment you had, that glimpse of fairness, it's over. But it doesn't have to be, because movements that endure are never just about one person. They're about values. They're about staying awake, staying involved, and remembering that economic dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. So here's my call to you. Whether you're a business owner, a factory worker, a young voter trying to make sense of it all, stay engaged. Keep asking the hard questions. Support leaders who put your community first, not just their donors. And remember that what we do next will decide whether this was a one-time disruption or the start of something that could change the future for good. Thanks for being part of this conversation. Let's keep it going. Let's take a moment to bring it all together. We started by looking at a system that wasn't working, a system that left too many Americans behind while rewarding the few at the top. Then we explored how Trump flipped the script, using tariffs not as a tax, but as a tool. He forced a global conversation, made bold moves that rattled the markets, and reminded the world that Main Street still matters. We saw how those policies didn't just shake up Wall Street, they gave real people in real towns a second chance. We looked at China's reaction, the numbers the media rarely showed, and what it meant when the world's largest exporter suddenly felt the pressure. And we talked about something deeper: trust. Trust in the idea that hard work should be rewarded, that playing fair still matters, and that capitalism can work for everyone, not just the insiders. But here's the takeaway I hope sticks with you. This isn't just about Trump. It's about what kind of country we want to be moving forward. Do we protect the people who build things here? Do we stand up to unfair deals, no matter how loud the critics get? And most importantly, do we stay awake, stay engaged, and keep fighting for a system that works for us, not against us? That part is up to you. So if this video gave you something to think about, if it challenged you, inspired you, or even made you ask new questions, don't keep that to yourself. Like the video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next conversation. Because this isn't just a video, it's a movement. And your voice, it matters more than you know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.